he so wishes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. Can I introduce to my right Justine Kennedy, the Director of Multicultural Affairs from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. To my left, Wayne Hunter, the Chief Operating Officer of the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And to my far left, Claire Hodgetts, the Director of Finance and Procurement from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I don't have an opening address. I'm happy to go straight to questions.
If you have an opening address there, feel free, but otherwise just straight to questions.
Thanks, Chair. And what I might do before just going straight to questions is to flag topics that, should there be time, I'd be pleased to address across the hour. The first of those is the Multicultural Community Fund. Welcome funds that I'll ask some questions about shortly.
So what page?
Oh,
all right.
I'll get there in a sec. I'll just flagging the topics,
Yep.
because I think there's a lot to remind ourselves in terms of the bipartisanship associated with much of this. The second is the languages work that is obviously subject of highlights and targets. And similarly, in the same vein, expenses, grants and subsidies that the new fund will talk to as well. Fourthly, the pilot Empowering African Youth program, and I'd like to be able to get to each of those topics along the way. So turning first to the new news, the Multicultural Community Fund, I think that might be best expressed at Budget Paper 5 at page 58. Budget Paper 5, Chair, the budget measures, and we see there at about point 5 on the page the Multicultural Community Fund. And for completeness of reference, we might just have Budget Paper 4, Volume 4, at page 26 and 27 open at the same time. And am I reading this correctly, Minister, that at page 27, where we see the program summary table going over the page, we see the grants and subsidies estimated result and budget and a $5 million variance there. That $5 million variance is the first budgeted year of the Multicultural Community Fund kicking in. I presume that's direct correlation.
Yes, that is correct. Obviously, it was quite a significant announcement in this budget, and I'm very pleased that we've seen additional expenditure coming into the Multicultural Affairs budget. Can I particularly just recognise that it is a brand new Multicultural Community Fund, very much focused on developing and upgrading community infrastructure facilities and also hosting festivals and events. Just by way of background is we obviously have a very diverse community here. People come in different waves of migration. We particularly see post-World War II migrant communities who have now got quite established community centres, both in metropolitan and regional South Australia. As Shadow Minister for Multicultural Affairs, we often spend a weekend night. But newer communities themselves would like to have their own community facilities. They're ambitious to have their own space. So part of the drive to have this new fund is how we can work with them to achieve that outcome.
And I thank the Minister for that introduction to the topic. So as I understand it, from the Minister's introduction there, that this is new funding and is not consolidated funds from any other form of grant
that
program.
Is correct.
This is new money to Multicultural Affairs, and I just indicate at the outset, like so much in this space, it's welcomed in principle and is likely to reflect the bipartisanship in this space. Just in terms then to address, as far as might be possible at this stage, and I completely respect wherever the government might be at, we've had some recent history at both state and federal levels of examples where there's a sort of an unparticularised fund that's established, and then there are questions about its distribution and the process for qualification for receipt of funds. We all know that there are very many cultural communities in the state doing all kinds of meritorious things, including in their own facilities, events, festivals and so on that are stood up for particular purposes. What can the Minister tell the committee at this stage about how the fund will be distributed? Is there a determination that the fund will inevitably be distributed in full each year, and in that sense are aspects of the fund already earmarked, or is there to be a yet to be disclosed published means of navigating that for those that might want to take advantage of it?
So it's more the latter than the former. So we are in the process of developing guidelines and programs for expenditure of this new fund. I guess if I can be very open with you about the situation where people have been talking to me over many, many years, and former shadow ministers as well, is the process to either purchase or develop community facilities does take some time. And of course that facility then also has to have planning approval. There is also the opportunity at times for councils to play a role in this. It is my intention to have a little bit of a different program from what we have, a very strict celebrate and expand facilities that open up, and there's a very strict process how it. We'd like to understand more clearly about people's desires and their intentions, and if they already own land, what that would look like, what savings that they have, more of a process where we work through them. Because the cost of buildings obviously increased dramatically in the last few years, but the desire for communities to have a facility of their own has not changed. So we will be very clear about those guidelines and the process of the expenditure of that fund, but I just wanted to be clear about where it comes from after many, many conversations with people, because it doesn't always run linear, the desire to do this, money saved, land purchase, building built, it sometimes happens over many years.
And the committee's heard the Minister, by way of introduction already, address perhaps if I might describe it as a long and proud continuum of migration to South Australia post-World War II through to new communities. Is there are there policy and funding objectives that sit behind this in terms of objectives to achieve particular outcomes in that what is an extraordinarily diverse range of circumstances and communities, despite some of the pejorative context of the analogy, is it more properly to be navigated in, as an analogy to sports facilities type funds, where if you have a sporting club and it's in need of facilities upgrade, it'll apply for funds, and if it meets the criteria, it'll attract the funding. That's one version. Is there more to the policy underpinnings about objectives the government's looking to achieve that we might see expressed in the guidelines in due course?
So we have had the Expand program, and that's been very successful for quite some time. The maximum amount of money that can be spent from the government is $100,000 within that grant program. So the focus has been around often toilet upgrades, kitchen upgrades. when communities have sought to buy their own facilities or have more major upgrades for facilities, then obviously that needs more support. And so that's understanding of the current restrictions that we have around the Expand grant and the desire for people to have their own facilities with it. The idea behind this, though, is that we will work with communities to go through the process because the timing of it often gets pushed out depending on planning approval and finances that have been sorted. But I think what a point of that you're making is the why. And the reality is 1 in 2 of us are either born overseas or have a parent born overseas. This is us. Diversity is the strength that we have. But people go through different stages of how they want to celebrate that diversity and preserve traditions and cultures. And we've had a long-term bipartisan view here in South Australia that we support that. And having safe spaces to gather is a key part of making that happen.
Some nuts and bolts then, perhaps. Can the Minister indicate to the committee when the fund will start taking applications and providing grants? Is there an anticipated number of recipients? And is there any maximum, minimum amount that will be subject to an individual grant?
So we're in the process of developing those guidelines and programs, and they will be clear and they will be available on the website of Multicultural Affairs.
Okay, so we'll wait and see. And if I could put a plug in at that point, just speaking from my own portfolio interest, I'd certainly flag an interest in providing any constructive input to that process if the government might make that available.
Even suggest in the conversations that we've all had with different groups who have indicated that they are interested in facilities, that we encourage them to, when those guidelines are out, to come and have some conversations because there is a longevity to making these things happen.
The Minister's sort of addressed this in part already. Again, perhaps by way of analogy, there are funds in other areas of government support where the access to the fund is subject to the applicant making a contribution of some substance to match it or contribute to it. For that, in case there's that kind of criteria or any other, is the government confident or satisfied or maintaining a determination that the amount will be fully subscribed in the first year and each subsequent year? And is there any proviso or hurdle, if you like, that might be a cause for that not being fully expended in any given year?
Yes, well, that would be my expectation, that it be expended each year. But we're very clear about when it's around community facilities, that timelines do move on when decisions haven't been made. And I'm not saying from a government point of view, I'm saying for planning decisions, financial decisions from the association. So yes, the intention would be to expand that money every year. But as we haven't finalised the guidelines and programs, then that is something that we would take into consideration about what that would look like. That would be a conversation with myself and the Treasurer, I imagine.
Well, and coming back to the Minister's characterisation, which I share, of this continuum of post-war and before that, migrant communities that are well established all the way through to new communities. In terms of the maintaining of confidence and transparency in the program, will there be capacity for all who might be applicants and or interested observers to see the criteria that are being applied, and therefore to compare and contrast where funds are going in the space more broadly.
Yes. As with all of our grant processes, there will be very clear guidelines and procedures.
Is the Minister aware of any example of a target for any of these funds as we sit here now? Any particular community, any example of how funds might be applied?
Well, we haven't finalised those guidelines or procedures. I would say there is probably more than a dozen different communities who have spoken to me over the last 5 years of their intentions and their ambitions, whether they're ready. Obviously, with the costs of land and costs of constructions have increased, but there are many who are interested in this program and will await those guidelines and procedures, and they will be very clear.
And the Minister refers in general terms there to what I describe as a capital expenditure, capital project. Will the funds be applied for a mixture of capital and, for want of a better term, operating expense? So on the one hand, the building or improvement of a structure, and on the other, the funding of a recurring event?
In general, not, but there is money for festivals and events. I think you're talking about two different things.
No, I'm
There'll be
trying
the capital,
to identify
but there is
what the fund will be
also
applied for.
ability to assist for festivals and events.
So to be clear, the Multicultural Community Fund that's described at page 58 of Budget Paper 5, is that confined to capital projects? No.
As I said in my opening remarks,
yes,
very clearly, that the focus on developing and upgrading community infrastructure facilities and assisting to host festivals and events.
Yes, and I understood the Minister a moment ago to be referring to other sources of funds for such events, and that's that's understood. There are existing sources of funds for other events, of course.
I guess one could say that there is significant unmet need,
yes,
whether it's Expand grant or the Celebrate grant. On average, I say to people, only about 50% of the applications that are put in are successful. So there is a gap where people would like to be supported to Celebrate or expand their facilities, and the amount of money that we currently have.
But suffice to say, to be very clear, the Multicultural Community Fund will provide funds for a mixture of capital and operating expenditure events,
yes,
a mixture of both. Is there any subdivision of the proportion that is contemplated? Could it all end up going on one-off or recurring events, for example? In principle, not suggesting that it would, but in principle, could it, if those were the most meritorious applications, or is there a preset subdivision in the fund each year?
So we're in the process of developing those guidelines and procedures.
Okay.
By the member for Wales.
And similarly, the answer might be the same, but is the Minister saying that there might end up being a subdivision to ensure that there's not, as it were, a 100% capital allocation, for example, or is the government keeping its options open about that as well?
We're in the process of looking at those guidelines.
Okay. And I refer particularly to the words of explanation that sit below the table. from which it might be derived that it's not in the nature of the fund that we'd expect to see a single payment of the full amount for the year to a single entity for a capital project. Is there any particular guidance that the Minister can provide or explanation to the committee at this stage about how far and wide, how dispersed the funds might be?
Well, those guidelines and procedures are being worked out now, but it is not my intention of the fund that that money would go to one outcome only. However, I have to say, when it comes to facilities, $5 million does not go quite as far as it used to when we've seen average house prices go up. So if people were looking to purchase a building and we were to support them with a grant with that, it could take quite a bit of that money. So, but that is not the intention of it.
Yes.
Those guidelines and procedures will be clarified in the near future.
And I appreciate that that's as far as it's got. And I guess the committee will be alive to the fact that the Multicultural Community Fund, as described and as set out in Budget Paper 5, is expressed in very round numbers. And so that points to the establishment of a nominal amount as opposed to anything that is earmarked or predetermined, and for reasons that are plain. The paragraphs of explanation below the table tend towards what the Minister's described in principle being the application of funds for a variety of purposes. Bearing in mind the Minister's response in terms of how far 5 million goes in terms of capital projects, is there anything else the Minister's able to say about perhaps the limits of the draw by any particular application? Would the Minister see it as a sign of success if indeed the bulk of that money in any given year went to any single project, as opposed to it finding its way into a whole variety of projects?
The demand is very clear.
Yeah.
There is no intention for it just to go to one person, but the guidelines and procedures are being established now, and there is much excitement that the Malinauskas Labor government has put this additional funding for multicultural communities, and that is how it will proceed.
And the Minister might understand a degree of pressing the point, given that time is somewhat, time's always short, but somewhat shorter than one might normally see in terms of an ordinary budget year. There's to be an election before the end of the subject year. Is it the objective of the government to identify the application of all of the funds, indeed, prior to the end of the budget year, prior to the election in March 2026?
Well, once those guidelines and procedures are established, then it will be very clear about what the process will be, just as it is with our others. So, for example, Celebrate program that we have, and 124 people were successfully supported through that, and they received up to $30,000 for festivals events, and that was to run over this last financial year. So we've always had quite clear processes, and that will, I have no intention of that not continuing.
And given...
And the Expand grant, for example, we've had the 2 rounds. Round 1, which is a smaller group, and this is where organisations can pay up to funding for up to $100,000 for equipment and infrastructure, security upgrades and community transport. In that situation, we ask for match funding for anything more than $50,000. To go to the point of the need, there was 187 applications that were received, but only 69 multicultural organisations were successful.
Having gone there, I appreciate the Minister referring to that process by way of analogy. Is there any reason why the government has determined to establish what it describes as a new fund, hence finding its way into Budget Paper 5, as opposed to simply providing more funds to existing programs or more to the budget? And I mean, we see that expressed in the program summary in terms of the $5 million extension to the program's budget.
Well, as I go back to what I've already said, that developing and upgrading community infrastructure facilities is obviously something that has been raised with me as Minister for quite some time. We particularly feel for newer arrival groups who are here, particularly those who have come as humanitarian migrants, the ability to establish their own facilities has been much more challenging. And that is why we as a government have made this significant decision. As I said, there is an unmet need with the Expand grant, but that is quite minimal about what you can have, maximum of 50,000 unmatched, up to 100,000 matched. So that is a significant program, but obviously doesn't enable a purchase of a community facility or an upgrade. So we're very clear that in order to support our diverse community, some who have come here in many different ways, as skilled migrants, international students or humanitarian migrants, we want to work with them to establish these facilities.
And I don't read from the Minister's answer any sort of flagging of an inadvertent bias in the objective sense or intent in the application of the Multicultural Community Fund so far as it might affect those new migrant groups. I hear the Minister loud and clear that this is overtly directed at all of our migrant communities from the very first through to the very most recent.
Perhaps I might even say those that are quite established are looking to renovate. I mean, if the member for Adelaide's area, we've just seen a significant upgrade of one of the clubs there that is very actively used by many other facilities, by many other groups as well. But the type of upgrade that is required is higher than the $100,000 and significant upgrades that are required. So sometimes we find where we have ageing communities, the way that they use their community halls is changing. They want a smaller area that they can use more regularly on a weekly basis, and then have a larger hall area that can be used by other groups as well. So it is not restricted to new people, newer communities, but obviously there is a growing need, and that's a group that the other groups that have been talking to me for some time.
And just noting that I think my gratitude, and I expect the committee's gratitude for the presence of senior officials with the Minister today. I just ask: is the government flagging a particular virtue, I suppose, in establishing the fund in the budget papers, albeit in general terms for these purposes, to distinguish the fund and its criteria and its application from what might otherwise be the sorts of election commitments that can become controversial, where the only grounds upon which the government might subsequently justify the expenditure is that, well, it was election commitment, ipso facto, that's okay, as opposed to the establishment of a fund that the Minister's described, if it doesn't already, will have published criteria, guidelines, a transparency for everybody's confidence, all the rest of it, that's akin to other programs of that kind, where there's oversight in advance, the ability to interrogate the application of funds and so on. Is that a fair?
The answer that you're seeking is yes.
No. And that's in praise, really, of the process. I'm endeavouring to if this is establishing appropriate best practice in terms of the disclosure of a government intent, albeit in general terms, then I appreciate the Minister's positive response. I've flagged 4 topics, conscious of time. Move to the second of them. And just as I do, might it be presumed, or can the Minister confirm that the Minister and or the Department will publish a periodic, perhaps annual, summary of the outcomes and
In general, they're available on the website.
Yeah, I thought so. I move to. So I think we're with Budget Paper 4, Volume 4, page 26 or 7 for the duration now, and so at page 26 of Budget Paper 4, Volume 4, and keeping an eye on the highlights and the targets, highlights for 24-25 and targets obviously for 25-26. And I refer to the first of those highlights, which is expressed in terms of a continuation to support communities to keep their language alive. What was the total amount spent on community language schools in 24-25, and how much is going to be spent in this coming year?
So this is an election commitment that we made about investing an additional $4 million over 4 years for community language schools. The funded one for 24-25 is $702,334 ex-GST. Now, that supports 93 active and fully accredited community language schools teaching 48 different community languages. In semester 1 of this year, 9,192 students were enrolled in the program. We work very closely with the Department for Education and, of course, Community Language Schools South Australia. If we reflect on 24-25, the activities are focused around school premises, personnel and pathways. We've made significant changes since coming to government in 2022 about proactively supporting community languages. To remind ourselves, often there are volunteers who can put their hand up every single week to support their community to keep their language strong. So from the premises point of view, we've continued to top up the funding to government and non-government schools that host our community language schools. That was a significant change in the last few years. Previously, only government schools received a top-up. From a personnel point of view, we're continuing to support additional staffing for community language schools of South Australia and looking at professional development training for those school leaders. One of the other areas that I was particularly interested in, and we've seen a significance of the dropout between the ages of 12 and 15 of young people learning a language, often through primary school. They're quite dedicated, their families are committed. And the Pathway program supports Community Language Schools South Australia to offer vocational and SACE pathways for secondary students who study a language at our community language schools. And this has meant, with a desire obviously to see some increased rates of Year 12 SACE language being undertaken, but people continuing it. One of the most important changes is people often quite felt isolated in their different schools, and we've had the establishment of the community language learning hubs now at Regency Park TAFE, Salisbury TAFE, Torrens University Adelaide and at Charles Campbell College at Paradise. These hubs aim to cluster several of the language schools together to share the learning spaces, materials and equipment. At the moment, these hubs support 12 schools offering 9 languages. And we're very pleased and anticipate there'll be an additional 100 students commence at the Charles Campbell College hub from term 2 this year. We also have been supporting a digital language learning hub to create and share teaching on e-resources of Arabic, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Greek and Farsi. With the development of this digital language learning hub, there may be an opportunity for community language schools of South Australia to have some income separate to government and to sell that digital language learning hub throughout Australia as well, to create some autonomy, to create some opportunity there. I've approved a funding proposal for the activities for 25-26. That's the fourth and final year of this election commitment. And that funding agreement will commence on the 1st of July this year. Can I just say this is an area that's been, for me, a rich opportunity to take something that's been around for a very long time and contemporise and support them in a different way, to make it accessible, to have the hubs for that connectivity with people doing different languages. And so I'm really pleased with the way it's rolled out, and I look forward to reporting on its successes.
So in terms of 4 million, am I right then in understanding the answer for 24-25 was 702,000? The minister's indicated signing an agreement for the year ahead. What's the quantum of that agreement for the year ahead? And is that representing the amount to be spent for that?
1.2 million for this 25-26. So every second year, community language school has an infrastructure component to support groups that own their own facilities, and they run classes there. So every second year, that happens.
And so therefore, that's a pattern that's repeated with the outcome that the 4 million is expended, the result of the agreement that the minister has signed for the year ahead? Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is correct.
And in terms of the receipt of those funds, will those funds then flow immediately? What's the time
yes,
line
it's a
for
very
that?
well-established funding pattern. We have the agreement signed, and then those facilities would go. Perhaps I can give some breakdown for you here. Funding to Catholic and independent host schools, 105,900. To the community language learning hubs, 90,172. And then staffing for community language schools is 90,000. So you can see how it's broken up over that period of time.
Is there such a thing in the data as the minister's referred to the 12 schools, 9 languages
in the hubs.
In the hubs, in terms of the overall, and if possible, broken down according to year, if that's a helpful breakdown, can the minister advise the committee how many students supported participating in the
692 in the hubs.
And overall though, so 692 in the hubs.
I think I spoke about that earlier. 9,192.
9,192 overall so far.
For semester one. That's how many were enrolled in the program.
That's a point in time for this semester one just passed.
That's correct.
And so we can do the maths, but is there a number that the government adheres to that might describe a cost per student?
I'll endeavour to get that answer for you. There's a calculation that's worked out that is paid to support per head of student to do that work, and that's been worked out with education over a long period of time. So 24-25 Education Department on a per student, they're allocated on a per student basis of 113,730, which is about $29.55 per student. $29.55 per student.
Yes, and the interaction with the Department of Education is clear. The Department of Education is providing advice to the Minister's Department in relation to those costs per student. Is that the right?
That is
that the way that
correct.
that's?
We have an agreement with them.
And the funds are coming from DPC via the Multicultural Affairs program to the Department for Education for that purpose.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. The previous minister is reminding me that the per student funding is Education Department funding, has been for some time.
So one of the key things with the election commitment was a multicultural lens over. So
Yeah.
education obviously has done the heavy lifting for many, many years in this area, and we respect the work that they do. We felt that there was an opportunity to lean in more strongly and to develop this in a more contemporary manner, and that's what that additional funding has done.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that additional funding in the amount of $4 million has been applied over the period, as the minister has indicated. Turning now to the third of the topics, again, still on page 26 and 7. I go about two-thirds of the way down page 26, the beginning of the program summary table, and then following that over the page, the expenses, grants and subsidies. The 24-25 estimated result is just short of $7.5 million, $7,493,000, and that is 675, I think, just doing the maths as I look at it, over the budget for 24-25, and there's an explanation of that by reference to some carryover, I think. But is there any explanation for that estimated result over budget? And while the minister's at it, is there please a breakdown of the grants and funding provided and to what groups, including that overrun?
So you're asking about additional expenditure. There was some support for the Ukrainian Community Support Program. There was a return of grant funding in previous year and a reclassification of expenditure across categories. That accounts for the differences. And
Minister, each of those three categories of spending account for that difference that we see between the budget 24-25 and the estimated result 24-25. Is there any particularisation of the amounts for each of the three categories?
I'll have to take that on notice to come back to you and look at that, but they're quite minor.
Well, and in relation to the first of them,
the Ukrainian support program,
yeah.
That was 175,000. I've got, yes.
And was that additional to funding that had already been identified and applied for that?
That was
for that
additional.
purpose?
So obviously, you've been very aware of how we've supported our Ukrainian community,
Yeah.
and particularly in Hindmarsh, they have a facility that is been operating some programs there over the last 3 years, as you may recall, people had to flee quite quickly. We have had some packages there, which is when they first came, they were on a visa that didn't allow them work rights or access to Medicare. And then we announced a package in March of 2024 for the new arrivals for the Russia-Ukraine conflict and Israel-Hamas conflict. That was coordinated by the Department for Human Services. We have been working with the Ukrainian Association here about other things. So part of that package was support of the Refugee Health Service, mental health funding, access to dental care, free Metro card and some food vouchers. But the specific one that went to the Association of Ukrainian South Australia, I understand, my recollection, it's gone for 3 years in a row, is to provide some language support services and settlement services. And can I take this opportunity to thank the association, who are very established here, and an older cohort of people who have opened their arms and their homes, and they're given lots and lots of volunteer time to support people as they settle here. And then we've given them additional funding to support that over 3 years.
And in terms of it featuring, in terms of that $175,000 featuring in the estimated result, the Minister's referred to the March 2024 announcement, and unsurprisingly, call it heavy lifting by DHS in this space given the circumstances. I'm not asking the Minister to provide the committee with particulars about DHS's involvement. Was there a particular reason for the 175,000, as it were, being identified on its own as distinct from carryover, and the timing of it
So this
coming
was
from this
a
program?
community support program that was specifically run by the Association of Ukrainians in South Australia. I think it was the 3rd year that had been funded, with the understanding probably in previous years that funding might not needed to have happened for the 3rd year, but it did. And that's why it wasn't in the budget previous. It was additional because obviously at the end of every year, when that community support program has conducted, and we audit it and we talk to them about it, and then we ask about the need and does it continue.
But then, considering the balance of the grants and subsidies that are the subject of that estimated result, we get a clue from the 24-25 budget, because it's a specific number, 6.818 million, and we've got a very specific number in the estimated result, 7.493 million. Can the Minister provide, and it may be convenient to table it in line with committee rules, or
Well, I can give you some more information.
in a convenient way, what the breakdown is and to what groups?
So one of the other additional expenditures was money to the Adelaide Holocaust Museum. That's $167,000 per annum for 4 years, as announced in the budget last year, to expand its educational activities. We know that the Adelaide Holocaust Museum has been a target for anti-Semitic behaviour. We obviously spoke in the Parliament on the use of extremist symbolism. These incidents identified a need for them to increase their security measures and the quantity of their education programs and exhibition. This additional funding enabled them to also expand its opening hours and to make sure that there's a knowledge out there of people, particularly schools have been going in as well. Just by way of background, the Holocaust Museum was, and the Andrew Steiner Education Centre, launched in November of 2020. That's at 33 Wakefield Street. And of course, they have a very active education program as well, which can be on site and online as well.
Did the Minister say 167 over 4 years?
Per year.
Yeah. Just to be clear for the committee, that was my understanding as well.
So the budget is 171,175 because it includes indexation for 25-26. So that was another change.
Yeah. And in terms of addressing the question about breakdowns and groups, perhaps there isn't time to be to set those out in full here. I wonder whether it may be
Oh, I
convenient.
could list them if you like.
Yeah.
But they are publicly available.
Yeah, they're publicly available, and,
Yeah.
and I wonder whether, for the sake of the committee's reference, there might be some compliant table that might be
Fully available on the website.
included. If that's the best reference,
Yes.
then I appreciate that from the minister.
It's very transparent, all on the website.
And the minister's addressed by way of example, the funding to the Holocaust Museum. In terms of perhaps a picture, a range of quantum, is there an upper, the highest single amount the minister can identify, and the lowest, just to give a range of those grants and subsidies?
I'll give you two examples: the 175,000 to the Ukrainians.
Yes.
The 167,000 to the Holocaust Museum. By way of backwards, they're the highest ones. They would be the highest amount
Right.
per annum.
Yeah, again, I thought so, but good to confirm. And the minister's indicated that's all publicly available, but those are the two largest amounts.
Yeah, they're the largest ones from 24-25.
And again, the minister might forgive me if this is completely publicly available already as well, but can the minister advise the committee the proportion of funding that is recurring or multi-year, as opposed to one-off capital or event expenditure that's the subject of those grants for the relevant year?
I think it's here. So we don't actually provide a breakdown of how much is for Celebrate and how much is for Expand, but I can tell you that the 24-25 Multicultural Grants Program budget was 6.971 million. So it moves between those three, and the Stronger Together money as well within that. So that's the Multicultural Grants Program budget is 6.971.
Conscious of the few short minutes remaining, and I've flagged the fourth of those broad topics. I just go there, and again we're at page 26 of the relevant volume, volume 4. Targets 25-26 might be the focal point, and the pilot, Empowering African Youth Program,
Number is up.
supporting the early intervention measures, culturally responsive services programs.
Yes.
What's the quantum of funding for this year coming, and over the period of the forward estimates?
So it's 2.5 million over the forward estimates, which was announced in state budget of last year. Obviously, we've just completed the first year of that program, and the expenditure for the Empowering African Youth Program for 24-25 was $617,128, and that is sorry. As at 16 June, so there may well be some slight change, and that's divided up between 153,000 for the program manager, 100,000 ex-GST allocated to the African Communities Council of South Australia, 3,140 to transport students for the launch on the 9th of May, 14,000 allocated to Flinders University for the development of a comprehensive monitoring, evaluation, research and learning plan for the 4-year program, and 346,988 allocated to program service providers for the provision of early intervention measures.
So
The 25-26 budget is 635,000.
So similar amount, slight uptick from this first year. So can I perhaps roll up a series of questions that might be conveniently answered altogether? what programs might be described as constituting the pilot as opposed to ongoing, and will the program as it proceeds be provided by the agency or in partnership with community groups that are funded for the purpose service providers?
We don't refer to this as a pilot anymore.
Yeah.
This is now the program that we will have, and it commenced in January of this year. Year one of the program was focusing on 7 target schools in Northern Adelaide that have high population of students from diverse African backgrounds. That's including Craigmore High, Mark Oliphant College, Salisbury East High School, Parafield Gardens High School, Playford International College, Roma Mitchell Secondary College and Salisbury High School. In January of this year, the Department for Education employed an additional African Community Liaison Officer to work in those participating schools. Mentoring, coaching and counselling, which is a culturally specific non-government service provider, has been funded to deliver the SACE accredited village program in those participating schools. The village program, which we think is something pretty unique, and we're getting fantastic feedback so far, is structured in-school group cultural support for African students, as well as one-on-one mentoring and case management for students who benefit from additional personalised support. Other non-government organisations involved are STARS, supporting survivors of torture and trauma, abuse and rehabilitation services, and Mission Australia as well. At the moment, commencing in term 1 of this year, there was 185 students enrolled in the program across those 7 schools.
Thanks. The time allotted having expired, I declare the examination of multicultural affairs complete. Further examination of the proposed payments for the Department, Premier and Cabinet is adjourned until 2:45. Call on the member for wait.